I'm Mark Unno, and I teach in the Religious Studies department. My area, teaching-wise, is Asian religions, which covers primarily East Asia, but also some of South Asia. And what that means in terms of religious traditions, it means Hinduism, Daoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Shinto, primarily. There are other strands of Asian religions. My research specialty is in Japanese Buddhism. And in recent years, I've also been doing work in the area and interface between Buddhism and psychotherapy. So when Dan and Carrie first approached me with the possibility of the involvement of religious studies faculty, including myself, he came to me first, and Carrie came to me first because of my interest in and work in psychotherapy, which is, of course, related to human services. So for that reason, they asked me to do the first class, which not only touches on specific area of religion, namely what we sometimes call early Chinese religions, because Daoism and Confucianism originated in China. Eventually, Buddhism became a very large and, for a period, the dominant religion of China. But Buddhism, of course, as many of you know, originated in India. So because of my work in psychotherapy and background in some areas related to family and human services, Dan asked me to help frame the topic of spirituality and human services. And because my point of contact is psychotherapy, my knowledge about human services, family and human services, is somewhat limited. So actually, you all can help me with those things. But before I get into the two areas which I'm going to talk about today, one is how to think about the relationship or the topic of spirituality and family and human services. And then secondly, the Chinese traditions of Confucianism and Daoism. So I just actually want to begin by just repeating some of the themes that you all raised here, that religion is a powerful force in human lives. And yet, in the curriculum of family and human services, it's often overlooked, even though the curricular orientation is to be inclusive and liberal, and yet one of the most powerful forces in the formation of human culture and human experience, therefore, is often not directly addressed in the curriculum. And that people have all kinds of experiences. So many of you noted that you draw powerfully on your own particular religious backgrounds, which sometimes represents a single faith, but as several of you noted, sometimes involves multiple faiths or multiple streams or strands of religion and spirituality that have been helpful to you or helpful in understanding others, but that some of you have had difficulty precisely because of your religious background. And I think that's as important as recognizing that religion can be a powerful, positive force. So that some of you are greatly attracted to how religion can infuse the field of family and human services, but others of you have had an aversion to the idea that religion might come into play in the work of family and human services. In any case, religion in any arena, not just family and human services, but in politics, in the global economy, in many other arenas, is a very often contentious topic. It's a hot topic, but a contentious topic. Nevertheless, it's a large part of people's lives. So the University of Oregon is a secular university. And interestingly, it's only because we are not a religious university, we don't have a religious affiliation, that we are a secular university, that we can have a course like this. Isn't that interesting? Where no one religious view is taught. And for that reason, we can all study different forms of religion, different religious traditions, kind of on an equal basis. Religion is very complex. So we're going to get into what that means, especially in terms of its history. And sometimes, some of you have expressed how you were inspired by or draw on your own religious background, your own religious experiences to work with other people or hope to do so as you progress in your careers. But others of you said, well, I'm not particularly religious myself, but many of my clients or the people I work with may be religious, and so this may provide tools for me to understand better how I might work with them or help them. So I think both of those are very important perspectives. And then family human services can involve work with individuals, but also with communities. And for that reason, then religion, which also works at an individual level, but also at a communal level, is very important. So I thought that taken as a group, you had many different ideas to offer one another, very diverse, but also that they fit together very well in covering a lot of the range of things that I think you're going to see throughout this term. So what I want to do in the first part of our discussion, and then if I understand correctly, we're going to have some group work, and then I'll say some specific things about Confucianism and Daoism. First part, I just want to sort of set the framework for some of these topics that you all have already brought up. So if you'll take a look at the handout that I passed out that says definitions. So the title of the course is Spirituality and Human Services. But in my field, we refer more often to religion than spirituality. So if and how spirituality and religion are related, we can get into a little bit more later. But I'm going to start the discussion by religion because that's where I'm used to discussing this in terms of sort of my academic training. And religion can mean a lot of different things. So I just listed a few things that it might be related to. Religion could be related to theology. What are the primary beliefs or commitments of a particular faith? Of Christianity, of Islam, of Judaism, of Buddhism, of Hinduism, Daoism, so forth. But immediately we kind of run into a problem because theology comes from two words, theos and logos, where theos really means God. It comes from the Greek word meaning God. And logos is really the logic or the meaning of God. But there are, in my field, in religious studies, we study a lot of religions that don't necessarily have God as the centerpiece of what they're about. So in those cases, some people would argue that maybe philosophy is a better word. So some people say, well, of course, there's many strands of Christianity, for example. There's not just Catholicism and Protestantism, but there's many denominations within Protestantism. There's many schools within Catholicism. And so that's also true within Buddhism. And in some forms of Buddhism, people say, well, it's better to call it a philosophy because they don't seem to believe in any kind of divinity or deity or God. Also Confucianism, people will say that, and even about Daoism. So theology and philosophy. And then people say, well, religion is not primarily about ideas, it's more about experience, especially a specific kind of experience that people will call religious experience. So how does one think about what is religion? Whether one is drawing on that in one's own background, one's own faith, or one's own practice, or one's own experience to work with or help other people, or thinking about the person who's coming to me. What is that person's experience in their religion? Or do I think of it in terms primarily of their ideas, their theology, their beliefs, or their philosophy? And then, of course, there are other very strong associations. What is the sacred scripture in that person's background? So a lot of times people will want to go to what are the main works that they rely upon? Do they rely upon the Bible? Do they rely upon the Quran? Do they rely upon the teachings of the Buddha that are contained in what are called the sutras? So oftentimes scripture plays a very strong role in thinking, in when one asks oneself the question, what do I think about religion? Oftentimes scripture is the first thing that comes to people's mind. And then history. there's a long history for each religion. And that history can be very complicated. So how is the history of that religion appearing in the person who's coming to me? And how does my experience of the particular history of my own religion affect the way that I interact with other people? So these are just some of the ways that we begin to think about religion in my field of religious studies. Other categories that I'm not going to discuss as much at length, but which are often mentioned, are myth and symbol and ritual. What are the myths that form the stories, the religious stories of a particular religion? And what are the prominent symbols that appear in those stories, in those myths? Symbols like the Christ symbol, or the symbol of the enlightened being in Buddhism, okay. The symbol of deities of compassion, symbols of compassionate or kind figures, like the role that the Virgin Mary plays in Catholicism. And then, how are these stories and symbols, how do they come to life? They often come to life through ritual. Those stories are given life. Those stories often are given power in religious services, attending church on Sunday, or going to a meditation retreat, going on pilgrimage. So these are all kinds of religious practices or rituals that help to give these stories and symbols power. And then how do we place the understanding of each person's view of these stories and the power of these stories and their symbols within the larger context of society? That is to say, what's the relationship between the individual person and the communal life of their religious community, of their church, of their larger religious organization, and society at large? And then, how does self-cultivation come into play in different religions? That is to say, it's not like, okay, I say I believe something, and that's the beginning and end of my faith. I might be introduced to a faith, or I might be introduced to a religion, but over time, my understanding or faith or commitment develops or deepens over time, potentially. Okay? And so you could say there's a path that takes some time, months, years, decades, or even a whole lifetime, through which my understanding evolves. So we could say there's a path of cultivation or self-cultivation. So these are some of the ways in the study of religion that we conceive of religion and therefore also spirituality. But one of the things that we really emphasize in religious studies is the complexity and ambiguity of religious history. So in some sense, theology and philosophy are at one end, and history is at the other end. Theology and philosophy, you might say, represent the ideal. That is to say, if you can live completely the theology of Christianity, or of Hinduism, or of Confucianism, then that's perfection. That's being complete. But at the other end, you can look at the long history of each of these religions, of Daoism, of Islam, of Judaism. Of virtually any religion is very, very complex. And one could argue very ambiguous. There are high points. There are low points. And if I'm a member of a religion, sometimes there might be some tendency. I want to say, okay, this is what it truly means to be a Buddhist, or this is what it truly means to be a Muslim, thinking only of the best parts. But there may be other parts. And if you're working with very diverse people who come from many different religious backgrounds, have their own particular histories, for them, for clients or various people that you might be working with in organizations, their experience might not just be the high points. Their experience might be the low points. So in order to have a nuanced understanding of religion, history can be very helpful. And in the course of 50 minutes, I can't give you a very complex history of Confucianism or Daoism, okay? But just this idea that religious history is often very complex and ambiguous. And for that reason, there's a huge range of experience that people have in different religious traditions. And just the awareness of history helps us to understand that. Does anybody have any questions or comments so far? Any questions or comments? Okay, so the next thing that I just want to kind of address and frame is the interface of religion and human services. And I want us to think about two possible relationships between religion on the one hand and human services on the other. And that's that on the one hand, their relationship might be complementary. That's to say, they might support each other and reinforce each other. But they might also conflict with each other. So that goes hand in hand in what I just said about the complexity and ambiguity of religion. But there is a very specific history to the relationship between what we might generally call family human services on the one hand and religion and spirituality on the other. So family human services, which is actually very pervasive in our society, it covers the whole range from social welfare to individual counseling and psychotherapy, to various outreach programs and services that permeate the legal system. But by definition, and that's one of the reasons why it may be underrepresented in the curriculum, by definition, it's a secular field. It can't be an inherently religious field because we have a separation between church and state. And because social services, the legal system, and then by their very nature, counseling and psychotherapy are part of the secular world, they're usually defined in secular terms as being separate from religion and therefore spirituality. In fact, if you look at the origin of some of the cornerstones of human services, and you can disagree with this, and maybe you can correct me actually in this regard, but a good part of it has to do with individual counseling. And counseling has its roots in psychotherapy. And psychotherapy has its roots in key figures like Freud and the Swiss psychologist Jung. And part of their idea of formulating psychotherapy and counseling came out of the larger, at that time, European culture and ultimately Western culture's rejection of religion as being insufficient for a variety of reasons. And so the development of a kind of a secular science which was meant to fill a gap that they and other people began to perceive as existing within the religious communities. So just to give one example. It used to be that before the 19th century in Catholicism, exorcism was widespread. People would go to exorcism for many problems for which people today go to psychotherapy. Today, the Catholic Church still has official exorcism, but it's a very small percentage. And for many of these problems, yes, people will go to their pastor or minister or father, but at the same time, many people will go to a counselor or a psychotherapist. Okay. Yes?
Would you tell me, or in the class, because I'm not sure what you mean by secular, what does that mean?
Okay, I'm going to answer that question, and somebody else had a comment, and I'm going to take that, and then I'll answer your question.
Oh, I had a question about how would you define the difference between spirituality and religion?
Okay, good. So I'm going to take these separately. How do we define secular? There's a lot of different ways to define it, but there's one really easy way. It's non-religious. Everything that's not in religion can be regarded as secular. So government can be regarded as a part of the secular world. It didn't used to be. And the idea that we have a secular realm is actually a modern invention that really began with the Protestant Reformation. So it's a Western invention the rest of the world didn't have a secular realm that was separate from the religious world. Most traditional societies, including Western society, was very religious, completely, until basically Luther came around and he said, look, the Pope, the Vatican, and the kings are all Catholic. They govern everything. But really, the core of religion is in the inner life of the individual. And it's a direct relationship. There's no intervention of the church between the individual's faith and God. And so let's start to separate that out from society. So that's actually the beginning. Even though there was a religious motivation, that's the beginning. And it's behind that. And Luther really emphasized study. He said it was very important to read the scriptures carefully to see that that was Jesus' message, really. And so that's actually what helped to initiate also the separation of education from religious society. So we actually owe a great deal to the Protestant Reformation for the formation of the University of Oregon. Okay? So everything from government, economy, law. In the traditional Western society, law was also part of the religious world. But in our society, law is part of the secular world. It's inherently non-religious. Even though, when you take the stand as a witness, you have to swear on the Bible. I'm not sure what that means if you're... yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? All right, so does anybody want to add to this discussion?
No, I had a question.
Yes.
When you said that the field of human services is secular, which is true, but aren't the client the people you deal with of different faith?
Yes.
Which you may have some client who may be abused based on their religion. For example, they have a husband who believes in certain religion that is oppressive and abusive.
Right. Very good.
That really involves a social service worker to understand that religion.
Oh, absolutely. So that's a very good point. So there's a big difference between taking into account religious factors in the work of Family Human Services and seeing human services as religious work, right? So I'm definitely not including religious factors, including religious factors helping one. Like you mentioned that religion has been key to your work in your own community, but the explicit agenda is not necessarily religious, right? So that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Okay, very good. So let's then turn to the question of the relationship between religion and spirituality. So this is very sticky and very much debated in my field of religious studies. So we just have a few minutes before we need to move to the next segment, but I just want to ask you, what do you think about the relationship between religion and spirituality? What are some of your thoughts? How do you relate them, religion and spirituality?
I feel like religion is much more the practice. It's, the reading of scripture. It's the rituals, like the church. But spirituality is they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I see actually spirituality as being the intimate experience that you have with your religion. So having, a relationship with God versus just going to church.
Okay.
That kind of correlation.
So more the personal or individual experience or the inner awareness or inner experience, okay? Anybody else?
So on that note, religion is more of the institutional part. I feel like the body, the church, or the group, more of the community, and then spirituality is more of the personal, individual feeling. Like a lot of people say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, and I think they mean by that, like, I don't go to church, but I believe in God. So.
Right. So that's very interesting, and that's not an uncommon idea about the relationship between religion and spirituality, especially in our culture. That kind of idea would be much less common in traditional societies, where people couldn't imagine becoming spiritual without being part of a religious community. But in America especially, and certainly in other parts of the world now also, there's this idea that, you can read, you can have your own experiences that have a spiritual significance for you, but without being a card-carrying member of a religious community. You might even go sometimes. You might try out different religions. You might go on a retreat, or you might enjoy an event. But then ultimately, you might say, I have my own spirituality. And I might even combine, people in America often combine different strands of religion and spirituality, which is available in a way that it wasn't. So some of you mentioned that my parents come from 2 different religious backgrounds. And if you're going to consider yourself religious or spiritual, it might be difficult not to combine if you come from multiple religious backgrounds. But traditionally speaking, in most traditional societies, people came from one background. And they lived under the umbrella of a religious worldview. So it's interesting to think about, what is that relationship? So these are some of the common responses that we have. And how then you are able to make use of the resources that this class presents you with will be interesting to think. So I just want to say just a few last things on this topic before I hand it back to Carrie so that she can take us into the next segment. Just want to take your comment, which is a very good one. So what if there's somebody who is a client, maybe you're a social worker or you're a counselor, and there's domestic abuse. Somebody, more often than not, a woman who has suffered physical, verbal, emotional, and/or sexual abuse, let's say by the spouse, and that religion plays a big factor in that abuse, both on the side of the abuser and the abused. So a lot of times the abuser says, well, my religion teaches me that my wife is my property, and if she does not obey me, I'm supposed to hit her. And then the wife says, I feel like I failed as a good wife, and that and that my religion teaches me that I'm being beaten because I deserve it. So it's very helpful, actually, that you specifically brought up that example, because you're also one of the people in the class who said religion has had such a powerful, positive impact on your work, that without your religious background, you can imagine having done the work you've already done. So I think that represents, a sophisticated view of at least 2 different ways that religion can function in the service or helping professions. That can be a powerful positive force, but it can be a powerful negative force. And all the more then, it makes it more important to understand the complex and ambiguous nature of religious life in human history. So I just want to end with one last story. We have here at the University of Oregon the first UNESCO Chair in Intercultural Dialogue and Interreligious Understanding, which is held by Dr. Stephen Shankman, who's the director of our Center for Intercultural Dialogue. So I was part of a number of faculty who was behind the development of the center and bringing the UNESCO chair here to the University of Oregon. So when they needed to hire assistant director, Steve asked me to join the search committee for an assistant director. And they've hired a wonderful assistant director, that's Kelly Totten. We had an incredibly strong field of candidates who came. So we could have actually hired any number of people that we interviewed, but there was one person that we hired who didn't get the job, but who was quite remarkable nonetheless. And there's something that she said that really struck me. One of the questions that we asked all the candidates was, in doing intercultural work and in doing interfaith work, what do you consider to be the most important qualification that you bring? And this person, along with all the other candidates, had quite a bit of experience in interfaith and intercultural work. So, we often heard answers like, it's important to have broad experience, working with a lot of different people, studying a lot of different faiths or cultures. But this person didn't say that. She dropped just a very short phrase. She said, drop the story. And when I first heard this, I wasn't sure what I heard. So I said, can you say that again? She says, yeah, drop the story. And then we all kind of looked at each other, and we said, what do you mean by that? And she says, well, in doing intercultural work or interreligious dialogue, it's really, really important to study the backgrounds of the people that you might be working with, or you might be partnering with, or you might be dialoguing with. And so whatever study we do, people we talk to, books we read, we start to develop a story about the people we think we're going to meet or that we're going to encounter. But she says, in order to actually work with another person who may be from a very different background from yourself, at the moment of encounter, the most important thing is to drop whatever story that you might have brought with you about who you think that person is or should be. Because the most important thing is, as much as possible, to really meet that person, to really see that person. But how can you really meet that person? How can you really see that person if you have a preconceived story about who you think they already are? So I thought, at that moment, I thought, that's brilliant. We should hire her. We ended up hiring Kelly, and she was probably the right hire, and she's done a brilliant job for us. But it really struck me. So the reason I'm saying this is because I hope that through this course and the tremendous work that Carrie and Dan have done, that you'll gain a lot of information. In a way, you're going to gain a lot of stories about what is Buddhism, Confucianism, Catholicism, Protestantism, so on and so forth, right? But at the same time, I hope that in your work, you are able to take that information and have it work for you effectively in your actual work with other people in such a way that it helps you to meet and to see and to understand other people, rather than becoming the expert who knows who another person is better than they do themselves. Okay? So thank you for sharing and for listening for this initial segment, and I'd like to hand it over to Carrie.
The music is not us. Mark created some questions for some small group conversations, so why don't we get like 3, 4 people per group? I don't know if you want to shift the desks around and then have some questions here, and we're just going to take 20, 30 minutes to just talk and just get to know each other. So go ahead and form your groups.
Should we just turn it?
Maybe, Carrie, why don't you read the questions for them? Okay, so if you just hold on for a second, Carrie will read the questions for you. Okay?
Okay. First question is, what is the relationship between religion and spirituality?
Mm-hmm.
Second question is, what are the possible relationships between religious communities, on the other hand, and an individual's religious life, on the other? Third question is, can there be spirituality outside of religion? If so, in what sense? In an absolute sense or in a relative sense?
Okay, good. Yeah, so we already began to discuss some of these, but I think you probably have more things to say to one another. Okay. So I got to overhear some of your conversations. I thought it was a very rich conversation. So what I'd like to do now is just give you all an opportunity to share some of the thoughts that came up, either individual thoughts that you shared or some of the insights that arose as a result of your discussions. And, you know, so anybody can start. Just raise your hand, and we'll maybe talk for 10, 15 minutes, okay? Yes?
Well, we were kind of talking over here, just kind of ending our conversation about how sometimes religion can get lost in like selfish ways, and I've been to churches where all they've talked about was money and giving money and begging for money, and that kind of loses the sense of like faith and like what they should be kind of saying to you. And like, I mean, I'm kind of a person that's on the outskirts of religion, so I come to church to maybe, you know, they'll give me some like improvement to my own thoughts and thinking maybe my spirituality will be a little bit different, and then sometimes it gets lost into money.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes?
Because she shows from the group, I was trying to extend what I was trying to say that my religion has shaped me and helped me. What I was trying to take from that first question was this difference between a religion and spirituality. I say that, according to how I understand it, is that religion has really been oppressive through time, and it has created some horrible things in different countries, like war and different things, in the name of religion. So then you go in spirituality, which I can go further by thinking faith, which I narrowed, saying that it's this relationship between me and God, period, which shapes me, changes me to be a loving person, to help and think beyond myself and think about other people who are suffering and help them. So that was why I say shapes me to help those people.
Okay, very, very good. All right, very good. Anybody else want to? Yeah?
Kind of to go off that, one thing that we talked about, I guess we'll move to the second question, but kind of to go off that, like possible relationships and the difference between being in a religious community and having like an individual, like personal, like religious life, is like for me, I guess, is a matter of integrity and being able to like do things because you know that that's what you're supposed to be doing and following your own religion, and then the possible like pressures of living in a religious community and the potential of like poor leadership within that community, and then next thing you know, like it could be to something where, you know, people are making choices and following rules and they don't necessarily know why and how it's affecting their lives, and that could be why, you know, religion could lead to wars and things like that. But that was kind of some of the things that we were talking about.
Anybody else want to add? Yes?
Kind of coming back to what you were saying too, it's you say like religion kind of has like a negative connotation to it as well, but I know a lot of people's lives that religion is the practice of their spirituality, and it's how they enrich their spirituality, and so and we also talked about how practices really differ from person to person. You know, it could be the practice of your spirituality, or you may see it. I don't know how to finish that thought, but it's just different from person to person.
Yeah. So, since I got to listen in a little bit of your discussion, maybe I'll just add to that. So, you know, participation in group activities like a Bible camp or a religious service or a Bible study group or group prayer meeting, these can all be potentially, depending on the person, they may report, so I'm not going to make any evaluation, but they may report that that's something that's positive in their spiritual lives. But at the same time, we've had views now expressed that religious communities and therefore religious organizations and institutions are complex, that they have to have leadership, they have to have organization, and when you have leadership in an organization, you have to have some minimal amount of funding that's going to make that all work. But problems arise if there's poor leadership or poor organization, or if there's too much focus on fundraising. So we can then begin to see the complexity of these, and of course this is not just limited to, for example, Christianity, but it could be said about almost any religious community or religion or organization. I think that's good. Anybody else want to add? Yeah?
One thing that our group talked about was just kind of some of the stereotypes, or Nabi mentioned now, like if you meet someone who is really religious, and I guess I'm thinking more in terms of Christianity, you, at least I'm kind of like, I don't know why I think this, but I'm like, that's kind of weird. They maybe are a little bit crazy or like closed-minded. You laugh at that. I mean, that's the way that I think of it. And so I'm hoping this class will help me kind of get over some of those stereotypes of thinking like, whoa, can't say anything because I don't know how you'll take it. I don't want to offend you. Right,
right. So it depends on what segment of society. Well, Oregon has the lowest church-going rate in the country, and probably Eugene is probably lower than the rest of Oregon. So, you know, it's kind of interesting. But so there can be stereotypes that some of us have had part or through much of our lives that somebody, and I think maybe one of the reasons why maybe you name Christianity is a couple things. It's the largest religion in our society, so you're more likely to encounter Christians than almost any other faith, followers of any other faith. But the other is that there is an element of Christianity which is essential to it, which is its confessional nature. And it began in the earliest church, right, with Christ himself, that it was very important for his followers to profess faith in Christ. So there's a confessional element, and what I mean by that is it's not uncommon. Not all Christians are like this, certainly it's very diverse, but it's not uncommon that you'll meet someone and that you've never met before, and as part of the first or maybe first couple of conversations, they'll say, I'm Christian. And it's not as common, perhaps, both because of the percentage of the population, that may be as big a factor as anything else, but also other factors, namely the confessional nature or history of Christianity, that you wonder what that means. If you're not from that background yourself, you don't know what that means when a person says, I'm Christian. So it's kind of, it can throw you off balance, not sure what to make of that. That's part of your experience, right?
I mean, it's interesting. I grew up as a Christian, going to church every Sunday, everything, but I still have that, and I don't necessarily. It's like obviously certain denominations I feel more that way, and I just don't know why. So I'm interested to learn more about myself.
Okay.
I kind of had a question. I took a class of professional ethics, which definitely dips into tons and tons of religious case studies, people who are religious and are trying to say they do or did an act that they, did because of their religion, because it told you to. Right. And a lot, and she, my teacher, she was a social worker and worked with these people and used real case studies, and one of them was that there was this religion where to become a man, the father had to perform certain sexual acts on him, and during the ceremony they took a bunch of pictures and they went to develop them, and the person who developed the pictures found them, and obviously it's very, very, very illegal in America, and so he had to report it, and then basically it was like, how far does religion count versus American law?
Right. So that's where
domestic violence.
Yeah. So that's where that's a very contentious area of our legal system, is freedom of religion. So the reason that goes hand in hand with separation of church and state. So we have freedom of religion, which means this is a very unusual thing in human history. Freedom of religion. Most traditional societies are dominated by one religion, and you don't really have a choice except to subscribe to that. It's not even, it doesn't even come up really consciously as a choice, because that's all there is really. But we are a nation of immigrants. We come from all different cultural backgrounds, ethnic, racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and we're free with some very important exceptions where religions have been, and people from religious backgrounds have been persecuted, right, in our society, even though that should be against the law. But there's freedom of religion, and then there's public-private separation. So there are certain things that are protected under privacy law, and then there are problems of violating the criminal code, which involve, including sexual abuse, sexual violation. So those three in our legal system, they clash. And of course, it's not just a legal matter, but that's one of the clearest areas where they arise. And so that shows, so now we're looking at what one might call the dark side of religion. And then it becomes very complicated, because if I come from a particular background, it could be religious or not religious, but I'm working with someone who's of a particular religious background. I find this out. Then what do you do? So in thinking about what it means to consider the interface of religion, spirituality, and human services, then one has to consider this kind of aspect as well. Yes?
I was thinking about a question, something that was going in my mind that speak about both. I think in every element, like you were saying, like in every religion you have Islam have element that's, and Christianity has different elements that are radical acts not accordance to what religious faith teaches them. There's a huge variety of Christianity.
Right.
So then when you are doing stereotyping of one group and you put in general, because I went to this place and that they call themselves Christians and they acted like this. Therefore, every Christian is that way.
Right.
I don't think that's fair because
Right.
there's elements of different how individually people perform their religion.
Right.
So about the question she asked, that was the question that I did ask a few months ago in one of my class, that people who, in the name of their religion, they get to rape or sexually abuse. Do you think that isn't that we don't even have to go and try to see the freedom of religion? That's breaking the law. Because
Right.
this is the United States of America. And if you are a guest worker, don't you want to report that?
Right. So it seems very clear-cut if we say, here's a case of rape, and there's a religious rationale being given for it. Clearly, it doesn't really matter what their religious background is or what religious reason they give. It's wrong, and you have to report it. You could say that, but you might think of issues that are much, much more complex. So let me give you an example. So as a result of our engagement in Indochina, the Vietnam War, what we call the Vietnam War, there were a lot of refugees that came to our country from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and from Laos, among the Laotians that came is one ethnic group called the Hmong people, H-M-O-N-G, right? So we have Hmong here in Oregon. So the Hmong people came here, and in some ways the Hmong people have had an especially difficult experience. And that's because they're basically were a tribal people who didn't have a written language until 1954, and who are a shamanic people. So their religious leaders go into shamanic trances or kind of shamanic states, and they're possessed by their deities or whoever. And then that's how they have their religious experience. That's how they convey their wisdom to the next generation, convey their knowledge to the next generation. And so they were brought into a hyper-intellectual, our society is hyper-intellectual, and about as far removed from their tribal origins as you could imagine. So there were news reports in the mainstream news, like Newsweek and Time and whatever, of Hmong people suffering what they call sudden death, and people didn't know why. But to me, it wasn't surprising that you take these people and put them in an environment that is so foreign to their previous experience. And I taught some Hmong students who were, obviously, they were first-generation college students, and they had enormous difficulties because once they became college educated in English, they couldn't explain to their parents, who couldn't speak any English and who were a newly literate culture since 1954, in a shamanic culture, speaking a different language, what they were becoming as Hmong Americans. The reason I explain this is one of the incidences that arose that was written about in a work called, I think it's called When the Spirit Falls Down, was the case of a Hmong child who was diagnosed as epileptic. This is a case in California. And the human services in California said, you have to treat this child, you have to give them medication. But the Hmong community was extremely upset because in their own culture, this child was considered to be a specially gifted shaman. Now, those of you who may know something about epilepsy may know that in a small percentage of epileptics, when they have an epileptic seizure, they have what they describe as like a mystical experience. So even though it's a very jarring experience to go have a seizure and go into the epileptic state, for a certain percentage, and it's a relatively small percentage of epileptics, when they have this epileptic seizure and are in that state, then they suddenly have an extremely blissful experience. So there's probably some overlap between what those epileptics report and what the Hmong people consider to be the gifted shamans. And in this process, in a sense, the Hmong people were had huge problems. It caused a problem for the human services establishment, but the child himself, I think it was a he, the child himself was perhaps the greatest victim, being pulled by forces beyond people's control. So I think there are cases where it's very clear cut. You have to step in and do something. But there are other cases that are much more complex. And one of the things that I hope will result from this course, not perhaps by this course itself, because they may only arise as questions, but in your longer study, in your longer experience, is to become more sophisticated and sensitive about understanding what maybe you don't understand. What is it that I don't understand? Or maybe what kind of questions can I ask to find out where is that person coming from? What are they experiencing, positive, negative, in their own religious experience, and how the work that I'm doing might relate to them?
I think that topic of not only different religions but cultures coming here and working and Americans working with them is so important, especially human services, because a lot of times, I mean, like you're saying, it's like two different ideologies, whether you're religious or not. If you're not used to these religions, you automatically think you're going to act by law. And especially, I think a lot of human service professionals go abroad to work with these cultures, and that's one of the big reasons why our country can have such a negative connotation with it, is because they look at us like we're just coming in to change everything you think and everything you do. And so, I mean, I guess that's another reason why I really like that this class was built to connect the two, because I think it's important for people to remember that it might be, against our laws and our values, but it's important to try and look past that and before you act, and try and see where it's coming from to approach it in a different way rather than just acting and enforcing law.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
About what you were saying? So, for example, some of what you said about epilepsy, and do you know how old was the child?
Like an infant, very young.
An infant,
Yeah.
So, at the same time, there's also other religion where the child may be running out of blood and dying.
Oh yes, yeah, right.
The religion doesn't allow
for
transfusion.
Right.
So let's step here to see that there's a lot of people who are professional who will be in the field, and you are a professor there and in religion, you've been in this field. So if we were to really stay for human rights, and knowing that the baby can defend, let's forget about spirituality and think about the human being.
Yes, good.
This baby can defend themselves. They are dying. For what reason? Because that religion doesn't allow them to get blood and live.
Right.
So, don't you want to think about that? Forget your religion, I'm going to step in and save the life of this child.
Okay, so I think that's a very good point. And one of the ways that we can, I think, perhaps fruitfully explore this question is in terms of consequences. So, in a way, as somebody who's in or aspiring to be in a helping profession or service profession, working in the field of human services, one of the things that you're likely to be called upon to do is intervention, right? And so what you do when you intervene is actually you're inserting yourself into the life of another human being and their family or their community. So you may think, okay, well, it doesn't matter their religious backgrounds, their religious beliefs, because this is just clearly wrong. The child's going to die, or there's going to be sexual abuse that's going to continue, and you have to step in. One of the things that may help one, regardless of whether one agrees or not, so I'm not going to take a personal stand on any of these issues for the purpose of this class, even though personally I might strongly agree with you. I'm not going to say that I absolutely do. One of the things that might help one to become more effective in this regard is to understand the chain of cause and effect that one sets into motion in the act of intervention. So once I am willing to, even though I greatly honor the work that you are considering doing, or some of you are already doing in fields related to human services, because it's not necessarily a field that has a large number of high-paying jobs, right? But the rewards can be, the meaning, but that's completely oftentimes erased by how meaningful the work is, right? So I applaud that greatly. In that context, when you, nevertheless, if you represent a social service, or if you become a counselor or psychotherapist, nevertheless, you come to take on a certain amount of authority and power, limited as it may be. And with that limited authority and power comes responsibility. So when you in taking a position, if you are a social worker, a social welfare worker, a counselor, a psychotherapist, and you take that position, part of what you're saying is, I also take the responsibility for being called a social worker, a social welfare worker, a counselor, psychotherapist, and so forth. And what that means is then, I become accountable. I become responsible for the consequences of my actions, including the consequences of intervention. So I might step in, I say, I have to do something, but I'm likely to be much more effective in my role if I have carefully considered as much as possible and have prepared myself as much as possible in terms of now, maybe I've stopped the destructive behavior or the problem, or I've prevented a death in the immediate scenario, but I can't just stop and then leave. Or if I do, what will become of that person? What will become of that family? What will become of that community? So there's tremendous responsibility when one intervenes in another person's life. And in some ways, there's a proportionately greater responsibility when you intervene in an area of that involves intense emotions, where people's most intense personal, philosophical, religious commitments may lie, which may be the most intimate, private parts of their life. So probably, personally, I agree. I probably agree with where you're going with your thoughts, but as kind of in a kind of an academic sense, my job is to sort of say, okay, what does that mean when we step into a situation? And what are the consequences of my intervention? And how do I understand, the range of my responsibility in terms of the eventual outcome? So I think the Hmong case is a very interesting case because it's ambiguous. It might not be the case that one can easily conclude that the human services were wrong. Maybe the child has a much greater chance of having an early death if no medications are administered, right? But the other side of it is maybe the child has what within another framework are very valid, very significant, powerful experiences that are meaningful to the community. And the medication shuts that possibility off. So then I really need to study. I need to do the background study, but I also need to do the first-hand study of the situation as much as it allows. If there's immediate danger of loss of life or severe injury, which isn't necessarily limited to the physical, but perhaps also to the emotional, then maybe I feel, without fully understanding where this is going to go, I need to step in. But even in that case, if you're going in as a professional rather than just as a friend, then you still bear to a certain extent the responsibility for where ultimately that story is going to go. I have to step in now, that's my feeling. But then without knowing, without being fully prepared to understand all of the ramifications, then I understand, okay, now I'm going to see the ramifications, But I'm really being derelict if I simply step away now and think, okay, whew, I saved that one, on to the next one. Especially because there's lack of resources in human services, there's not enough people. And so you're going to be stretched in terms of what you can do. So the other side of it is, you can't beat yourself up saying, okay, I've got 30 cases today, and I saved 5 lives, but gee, I didn't go far enough. Okay? But at the same time, it's also important to, so consider all sides.
I think also something that's important to be known. I'm in FHS program, and like I don't think any of us really have the ultimate power to really determine whether or not our client's going to make the right choice or the right choice in our eyes. And I think that that's something that's really important to be said, is that so say if my client is if there's a domestic thing, I can report it, and then that will no longer be in my hands, or then we can encourage a different choice to be made or something like that. But ultimately, I mean, as a counselor or as a human service professional, our best interest is the best interest of our client, and if that's a choice that they're making, then we have to kind of abide by that, and we can offer educational things, but I think that's something that's important to be known.
Good. So let me complicate the picture a little bit more, okay?
This is interesting.
Good. Let me complicate the picture a little bit more. So let's say one learns of a situation of domestic violence. Now, the evidence that we have, by its very nature, must be anecdotal, and it's not statistical in the scientific way that we would like. But I have sufficient knowledge that one has to take seriously the following scenario, which is that there can be great differences on the system's treatment of cases of domestic violence depending on class, race, and ethnicity. That I have heard sufficient anecdotal evidence to believe that I must take seriously accusations that have been made that if you are not of the dominant culture in one factor or another factor of diversity, that when a case of domestic violence is reported, that often the system will work to not simply resolve the dispute, but actually to take away the assets of the entire family. That it can become, that I have seen it described as an excuse to repossess or to possess the home and the assets of the family. For example, if a husband is accused of domestic violence, and it's not uncommon that it could just be a very strong verbal conflict, but once, for example, once the 911 call is made to the police or whoever, then the system gets involved, and depending on the factor of diversity, it's not infrequent that then the husband is jailed, then can't go to work, then the bills don't get paid, and then the mortgage isn't paid, and then the house is lost. And the wife never intended for the husband to go to jail. That this is not a rare occurrence. Right? So if that's true, and because the evidence is anecdotal, I can't state this as objective fact. But if this is true, then the point I'm making becomes relevant, that it's important to understand the scope of your actions. And nobody can be perfect, right? Nobody can anticipate and take responsibility for everything. But it's important to understand, so we can transfer this into the realm of religion. What effects will I have? How well do I understand, to the best of my ability? Based on limited time, limited resources, have I done the best that I can to study the situation in terms of the involvement of religious factors so that I could be the most helpful rather than unhelpful? Okay.
I was going to say, like, one of the things I've learned about that is that if a woman comes to you and saying she's, you know, getting beaten, there isn't any law as in any field that would make you have to report that. That would be your own choice. And depending on the agency in which you work, you're probably going to get sued. If they lose the house and all that is caused by you, she's going to get a lawyer and she's going to come after you and your agency. Is what I've learned, that, you know, the only things you have to report are child abuse or the abuse of an elderly individual. So it's with domestic violence, that's what's so hard about that, is you hear the stories and it's really sad, and your first gut instinct is to run out and get the perpetrator arrested, but that could have severe consequences for you, whether you're a psychologist, a social worker,
right,
a psychiatrist, a doctor, PhD, it doesn't matter
right,
what your license is.
Right.
But,
so the, well, you know, restraint orders and then possible incarceration has to be initiated by the party directly involved, so by the spouse, essentially. But once the spouse reports it, then at some level, Human Services gets involved. And they may play a role that has potentially negative consequences for the parties involved. That's what I'm saying.
I want to go back to that religion and as consequences that kids get abused and so forth. I lived in Toronto, Canada, which I'm a Canadian citizen there too for almost 8 years. In Toronto is a huge city. You have people from all over the world.
Very cosmopolitan.
Different beliefs
right.
Of different religion. And we have different calls here. There are probably people who are in FHS, people who are in education and so forth. But according to what I think is that being in the field of FHS, for example, it's more than just a job, it's a passion. Because you want to be serving the people, you want to be advocating for them,
right.
And sometimes you even put your life on line. And that this can be not here in the US or can be international, some of those work we do. So you have done, we have a group of maybe students or people who have graduated who have go and do investigation based on what they heard, and the truth evidence, they found evidence that yes, these kids are being raped non-stop for the sake of religion or for the sake of the sect, whatever they have, or being abused or and beaten. What can we do, because we have that passion to come and defend this kid? So what I was thinking is that beside the legal thinking and saying that I can do this, I can this, there's always a way. For example, for the work we do in Africa, in oppressive government, where there's no window to get in, we find a way where we get legal to custody of the kids and put them in foster home, and the government wants you to monitor those foster homes. If there is abuse, they may not punish them, they may just lose that privilege of having funding going toward them, and then you put it in a safe house.
Right, so there are measures that can be taken. You have to be, in a sense, you have to be resourceful, and there are resources. Right, okay, good, right. Okay, I just want to return to her point one more time, because there was one point important point you were making that I just want to make sure everybody got, which is the other side, which is that when a spouse, and it's often the wife or the female partner that reports domestic abuse, that they can often be victimized a second time by the act of reporting. That's what you wanted to say, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right, okay. So good, let's take a break for 5-10 minutes. I'm going to spend a little time introducing some key ideas from Confucianism and Daoism, which are major religious streams that come out of China. And in order to do that, I want to show you a diagram which most of you have seen. I use the old chalkboard method, okay? So, how many people don't recognize this diagram? Don't recognize it? All of you. What is it called? Yin and Yang. Yeah, right. It's more accurately pronounced Yin and Yang. Okay, but anyway, so Yin and Yang is in the background of Chinese religion generally, and it's in the background of both Confucianism and Daoism. But also, oftentimes, Confucianism and Daoism are called the Yin and Yang of Chinese religion, and that's because one of the things to think about in the context of this course is, what does religion mean? Because religion is a Western word, and it's been applied outside of Western religions, but is it applicable in the way that we usually think about it? So generally speaking, Western religions are one might say comprehensive. That is, in the traditional, at key formative points, they were comprehensive. They covered everything from birth to death. Birth, rites of passage, of coming into adulthood, of marriage, of death, even legal matters covered by many of the major religions. But religions in Asia have not always been comprehensive in that way. So that it's not unusual to be, for example, in Japan, both Buddhist and Shinto. So I remember when I went to Japan when I was young, and I took a bus tour of Kyoto, which is one of the ancient capitals, and the tour guide said 70% of Japanese are Shinto and 80% are Buddhist. Okay, and many, if not most, Japanese had a Shinto-style wedding and a Buddhist-style funeral. Now, a very large percent, I don't know what the percent, maybe 40%, maybe even higher, have a Christian-style wedding in a Christian chapel, but will still have a Buddhist funeral. Okay. What does that mean? They're actually only Christian for a day, on the day of marriage. And that's largely influenced by the fact that Western bridal magazines and bridal culture have influenced Asian culture. But because they've had this role-based view of religion traditionally in Asia, where you could be Shinto and Buddhist at the same time, they didn't see a problem being Christian and Buddhist at the same time. Whereas in the West, you wouldn't be Muslim and Christian at the same time, generally speaking. You probably wouldn't even be Baptist and Methodist at the same time. Okay, so nevertheless, many of you have said, well, I'm influenced by multiple streams of religion, so it's not exclusive. But historically, Western religions have tended to not need to have multiple religious identities because they provided everything. But America is different that way. We have multiple influences in our families. We often choose to have multiple influences, all right? So in China, then many people are both Confucian and Taoist, even though Taoism arose in opposition to Confucianism. But this diagram makes it easy to understand why that might be the case, because Yin and Yang are opposites, and yet they're complementary. So that they can't be reconciled in the way that we usually think of logically, that you can find the common ground so that you can blend them together. No, they're opposites, and precisely for that reason, together they can form a complementary whole. Although there are people who are predominantly or exclusively Confucian or Taoist in Chinese history or in Chinese culture, many people are Confucian and Taoist, sometimes at different times of the day, sometimes at the same time of day. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what that might mean. And I'm only going to highlight a few key points. Really, I mean, in our department in religious studies, we offer multiple courses on each religion, multiple courses that deal with Buddhism, or with Confucianism, or with Christianity, or with just early Christianity, more than one course just on early Christianity, or on Islam. So the idea that we could give you any kind of sufficient background in a half-an-hour lecture on any religion it seems unrealistic from our own perspective. But I think hopefully we can we can provide a useful resource in highlighting some key themes, understanding that it's just a kind of a beginning. And some of you may be already familiar with some of these things. So I'm going to talk about Confucianism first, then Daoism. Confucianism, if you look at the handout, is named after its founder, Confucius, which in the Chinese pronunciation is actually Kongzi, or originally Kongfuzi. Kongzi. And we only have the word Confucius because some of the earliest figures to go and study Confucianism, the teachings of Confucius, were Jesuits, were Catholics. And among the Catholics, of course, some of you know, Jesuits are among the most scholarly, engaged in the most study. And so when they were sent to China, they wanted to know, well, for us, Jesus is the most important figure. For the Chinese, who's the most important? And they learned that this figure, Kongfuzi, was among the most revered. So they said, you know, in medieval Europe, Latin is the high language. So even in our culture, in American society, when we want to give something a very special feeling in terms of a name, we Latinize the name. So that's what they did. They took Kongfuzi and they gave it a Latin feel and made it Confucius. And then also with the second great Confucian, Mencius. In the Chinese pronunciation is Mengzi, they made it Mencius. So these figures probably lived somewhere between the 6th and 4th century BCE, so roughly 2,500 years ago. And you can see from the other handout that I gave you, it'll give you some overview of key ideas in Confucius's world of ideas. But the basic matrix of Confucianism is there's a kind of a three-stage understanding from what we might call the cosmos to society to the individual. Now, if we look at a religion like Christianity, we have heaven and earth. And mostly in contemporary Christianity, most of the language is about heaven and earth. There's not as much discussion of hell in contemporary Christianity as there was in classical times and earlier times. So I'm not placing any value judgment on that. But at the very least, there's a lot of discussion of heaven and earth, which means that they're separate realms. They may be connected in some way, but they're separate. They're qualitatively different. The realm of the divine, the heavenly realm, and the earthly realm. In Confucianism, we don't have that separation. It's all continuous. That's why they have a word, tian, which some people translate as heaven. And in some ways, it makes sense because tian is often also used in contrast with earth. Tian di is heaven and earth. But when they mean heaven in that sense, heaven versus earth, it means everything that's up there in the sky, which we often consider to be the universe or the cosmos. So it's probably better to translate tian in terms of a religious understanding as cosmos. And the main thing about the cosmos is first that it's inherently harmonious. So the universe is inherently good. But that inherent goodness isn't overseen by a supreme deity or divine being, but rather, in many ways, is kind of impersonal. So in some ways, you could say it's nature with a capital N. The cosmos is nature. It's inherently good. It's inherently harmonious. The sun rises every morning. Water always runs down a hill. And that enables us to irrigate. And the tides are regular. That enables us to plan for how that affects human society. So then the second great characteristic is that everything's on a continuum. Because nature, heaven, the cosmos is inherently harmonious, human society, if human beings live in accord with nature and with heaven, human life will also be harmonious. And the main thing about human society in that regard is humans are inherently social creatures, are communal. So it's not the individual human being who has to live in harmony with nature or the cosmos. It's human society that has to be based or modeled after the inherent harmony of the universe. And the ability of an individual human being to live to flourish, to live a good life, really depends on blending with the harmony of the community, and the community, to be harmonious, needs to blend with the inherent harmony of the universe. So there are some specific things that are mentioned here, but for the purposes, for the very brief time that we have together today, I want to emphasize just one or two ideas. And the first of that is that at the very heart of that, in terms of human relationships, is the relatedness of human beings to one another. So that in order to live a good life, in order to flourish, then one has to live a virtuous life, which is called de. And the primary de, the primary virtue, in many ways, is ran. And this Chinese character is made up of two parts. It's made up of this part, which originally comes from this. You can see why I gave up my life as an aspiring artist. This is actually originally meant to depict a person. And then this part is actually an ideograph, 2 bars for 1. E, if you want to say 1, it's 1 bar. R, for 2, is 2 bars. And san, 3, is 3 bars. Conveniently, I won't go into 4 because it's not 4 bars, okay? But anyways, 2 people. This is in many ways the primary virtue, often translated as humaneness, benevolence, humanity. That it's your relatedness to other people that's the source of your virtue and your good life. And within that, the most important relationship is the parent-child relationship. And especially the father-oldest-son relationship. So historically, Confucianism has been very male-dominated because of the great emphasis on the father-oldest-son relationship. But regardless, family relationships carry a sacred significance because that's the source of your ability to be virtuous. If your parent is virtuous and you follow your parent, then there's a great chance that you yourself will be virtuous. You don't always have to follow the parent. If the parent is unvirtuous, then you might have to correct the parent. But it will be by the power of your virtue that you correct your parent. That it's important not to violate the emotional bond between parent-child. So there's a famous episode in which Confucius says to his disciples, the student says, if the father steals a sheep, should you report him? And Confucius says, no, don't report your father. Why? Because it'll violate the emotional integrity of the parent-child relationship. It's not that the father should be allowed to steal, but that if you report the father and that they have to go to jail for stealing the sheep, then you'll break the trust in the emotional connection. Maybe you can correct the father. And so there are stories about very, very virtuous Confucians who are abused by their parents, but they're able to reform their parents and get them to be virtuous, but not by reporting them to the police or sending them to jail or whatever, or taking them onto Montel or a talk show, okay? But by being so virtuous, but that by the power of your patience and virtue, that the parent is affected eventually. And I think Confucius is not the only religion that has this kind of story, but it especially places emphasis on this kind of story. So just this one piece of information, how might this influence somebody who's working in family and human services? Maybe you're not Confucian, but the client comes from a Confucian culture, is heavily influenced by Confucian values. Well, let's say that there is abuse in that family, and that maybe your feeling is, the best thing to do is they need to be isolated from their family so that they're no longer affected by that abuse. And maybe that is the right thing, but if you know that they come from a background of strong Confucian values, and then they themselves still feel very strongly in a positive way about their Confucian values, then you'll have to think carefully about how you might go about separating them out from the physical situation and helping them. Because they may feel, yes, even if they recognize, yes, it's an abusive situation, but then my abusive father, my abusive mother, they're first-generation immigrants, and I was raised in this country, so I'm a native speaker, and so even though they're abusive, if they don't have me, they're gonna have real problems. And so how to think about that? And there are other factors that may come into play, where community is the basis of identity rather than the individual. So, for example, in some forms of religion, including some Western religions, the primary identity is my relationship to God. That gives me a certain degree of independence from my family. Because if I feel my family members are not acting in the right way, or they're abusive, or some other problem has arisen, or I have a family member who's an alcoholic or drug addict or something, I could say, well, I love them, I want to help them, but if I remain in this situation, the relationship is toxic for me, and so I need to remove myself, even if it means that they're going to fall down a deeper hole. But I have a support for my own spiritual well-being because I have my connection or relationship directly to God. So I can still go on. And then maybe at some point, I can go and help again. But maybe somebody who's been heavily influenced by Confucianism may not have the same feeling. Because if the source of their identity is the community, is the family, is the parent-child relationship, then removing themselves from that may have two effects. Psychologically, they may not be able to find their bearings. Where am I? And secondly, if the community itself places such great emphasis on the community as a source of personal or individual identity, if a person removes themselves from that community, they may be strongly excluded for a long time or forever. It may have consequences that are much more dire than one might understand not coming from that background. Okay? So there are many, many other things that I could say about Confucianism, but many people do feel family is a powerful source of support. But at the same time, precisely because emotions are most intense in family, family relations can be among the most difficult relationships. So let me ask, you don't have to raise your hand, you don't have to respond if you don't want to, but I think it'll still be telling. How many people have neither had the thought or experience that family is a powerful source of comfort, but also a powerful source of conflict? How many people in this room have not had that thought? Okay, some of you may not want it to reveal your own personal experience, but if this is any indication, then it suggests that many, if not most of us, have either experienced or understood that family is really important in a positive way, but family can also be a powerful locus of conflict. So even though I'm describing something that's very specific now to Confucianism, it's not impossible for many of us to understand the Confucian worldview. And it's very interesting to look at something like our legal system to see that our legal system actually recognizes this ambiguity. So on the one hand, our legal system is based on democratic notion of individual civil and human rights. It's a very individualistic system. Nevertheless, the legal system also recognizes the inviolability of immediate family relationships. Can anybody give an example of that? I'm going to give you one example. Immediate family members are not required to testify against other immediate family members, even if they know, even if people believe and that they in fact know, they have possessed knowledge of the guilt or innocence of that person, because it's considered inviolable. As a child, you're not required to testify against your parents. as a wife or a husband, you're not required to testify against your spouse.
In American law or in Chinese law?
In American law, right? I don't know about Chinese law. In American law, okay? So that just gives you just, one taste of Confucianism. But I hope it gives you one example, on the one hand, of factors one might need to consider in working with or in relating to people who've been heavily influenced by Confucian values, Confucian background. And then the other, which is that actually the study of other religions, including Confucianism, can help us also to think about our own background, our own experiences. That religions can mutually illuminate one another. Now, I'm going to go on to Daoism, but I want to mention one other thing about Confucianism, which is, as I mentioned, virtue is very important. And virtue has to do with what you do, not what you say. American society, being articulate is a highly valued skill or virtue. Why? Because we're a nation of immigrants. We all come from different backgrounds. So the ability to explain ourselves to others is both necessary and valued. But not so in Confucian society. There's a common Confucian expression, count to 10 before you speak. Well, if you're taking a seminar at the University of Oregon, you always count to 10 before you speak. You'll never get a chance. Okay. Why do they have this value? Because we also, to a certain extent, have this value, which is talk is cheap. And its actions speak louder than words. In a culture or in a religion or tradition that greatly emphasizes virtue, its character, which is built on incremental cultivation of individual virtuous actions, it's what you do, not what you say. So being too articulate is criticized in Confucian culture as being glib. But in our culture, to a certain extent, being articulate beyond your ability may be valued. For example, when you go to a job interview, when I went to a job interview, to interview for my first position at a university or college, they said, Mark, are you interested in teaching a course? And can you teach a course on women and religion? I said, oh yes, I've been dying to do that, and yes I can. I was interested, but I had no background. But you're not going to say no at an interview, are you? So when you're young, you can do that in our culture. When you're young, you can make up ground on the job. You have the energy. You have the wherewithal. You still have a fluid, flexible mind that you can make up the lost ground. So what I did, this was actually, I got a job offer at a university out of graduate school, but I was interviewing for two jobs. One was a tenure track job, and the other was a postdoc. And lo and behold, I think this was just pure luck, I got both offers. So I took the postdoc, and then because the postdoc was only 2 years, the university that made an offer to me said, well, look, it's only 2 years. We'll wait for you if you want to come and fill our position after you finish your postdoc, and you'll be better trained. I said, all right, well, thank you very much. But it wasn't a binding agreement. I ended up not going back to the university. But after I went to my postdoc, I thought, you know what? If I do go back to that job, I agreed to teach a course on women and religion. So after my first semester in my postdoc, I took my dozen best female students and I said, would you guys like to do an independent study on women and religion? They said, yeah. I said, why don't you guys set up the syllabus and why don't you teach me how to teach the class? So I had a brilliant group of women who set up the course and they taught me how to teach that class. And ever since then, more or less every other year, I've been teaching some version of that class, right? So to a certain extent, you can make up your ground, and as long as it's done within a realistic frame and you can deliver the goods, it's okay, but not in Chinese culture, not in Confucian culture. Why? Because when community is more important than the individual, if you start talking beyond your ability, you're putting yourself ahead of the group. And I say this because this still influences not just first-generation immigrants. Confucianism isn't just Chinese, okay? Confucianism has had a profound influence all throughout East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, even Vietnam, because there's many Vietnamese who are ethnically Chinese. I'm sorry. Stay away. Anyway, so as I was saying, suddenly the glib professor's at a loss for words. So I find even now there are college-age students who come from an East Asian background, and they often themselves do not know that they are influenced by Confucian values, who have difficulty entering the flow of discussion. And they don't know that it's because they've been inculcated unknowingly, subconsciously, with these kind of values. So there are many areas. So these just give you 2 points. What does it mean, the relationship between the universe itself, society, family, and the individual? And then what is the relationship between virtue and articulacy? Okay. So there are other things I could say about Confucianism, but I hope that just gives you 2 markers. Yes.
Speaking of speech, I'm not sure if it's part of Confucianism, but I know in Japanese culture, like the idea of truth and speaking is a little bit different from ours. Like you can say something that's not necessarily true, kind of a white lie, to keep the group harmony or the personal relationship.
Right.
Could you talk about that?
Oh yeah. Well, it's related to these Confucian values because of the communal aspect. But one thing specific to Japan is Japan has land area approximately equivalent to the state of Montana. Okay. They have a population of approximately 100 million people. Now, of that land area, about the size of Montana, about 15% is arable land because it's a volcanic island nation. Only about 15% of that land is farmable. Much of it is really not realistically inhabitable. So you only have a very small percentage of that land that can be built up in cities. So it's really crowded, right? So this is not just a Confucian thing, it's partially a practical thing that you cannot have on a day-to-day basis confrontational debate and arguments. You just won't make it through the day. So people find ways to smooth over differences in order to get through the day. And so one of the things that happens in Japanese society is not out and out disagreement, but people will say maybe. And then there's a lot of body language. So another thing is that it's also, this is a partially Confucian influence. So one of the other things about Confucianism is a ritual-based society, where you sit on around a table, how you greet other people, how you greet elders, how you greet people who are in socially inferior positions. This is all highly regulated in terms of language, body language, and ritual. So this is also pervasive East Asian influence. Our society is more gesture-based. We make all kinds of hand motions, partially to make sure people keep their attention on our face as we speak, or we wander around a room to keep people's attention on our personality. But much of East Asian culture is ritually based. And that ritual provides very subtle cues for, yes, you can do that, we'll think about it, no, you can't do that, without breaking out into open debate about it, because it's just emotionally too overwhelming in such a physically close-knit society. But it's not just physical, it's social. So one typical, very complicated relationship in East Asian societies, China, Japan, Korea, is the relationship between the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law coming in to live in the same physical space, the same family. Because in most traditional cultures, not just East Asia, most traditional cultures, you have multi-generations in one house. And where the parent-child relationship is so intense, the child never really leaves the parent. So then, when the son gets married, then there naturally arises potential tension and conflict between the new female in the household and the pre-existing authority, which is the mother-in-law for the daughter. And psychologically, many Japanese men never leave their mom, so that the wife becomes the new mommy. Then they get 2 mommies, essentially. But that's a whole nother class. It's a whole nother class. Okay? All right, we're going to go on. Touchy subject there. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, Daoism. So Daoism, as I said, arose in part in rebellion against Confucianism, saying fine, families are important. They subscribe to the same basic view: the universe is a harmonious place, and this harmony is reflected in nature. So the fact that in most traditional societies, including ancient China, 90% of the population are peasants. They're farmers, essentially. So farming depends on understanding the laws of nature, not in a scientific way that we understand natural science, modern natural science, but how to plant the fields, the movement of the sun, the availability of water, the texture of soil, and all of these things. And it is a miracle. Many of us who live in the 21st century are completely removed from the source of our food. For many of us, food means going to the market of choice or going to Safeway. But that's a very, very recent invention. For most people in most of human society, it means working the land. So on my mother's side, my grandfather was a grape farmer. And he touched the soil and he loved the soil. There's a magic about that. There's a beautiful harmony about that. And so the Taoists and the Confucians alike subscribe to the inherent harmony of the universe and the inherent harmony of nature. But the Taoist says there's too much emphasis on two things. Too much emphasis on learning and studying all these rituals, studying the wisdom of the ancients that's handed down often through the parents. Too much studying. Why? Because it leads to too much thinking. It's too top-heavy. So I think it's not only ancient Chinese who felt you spend too much time imprisoned in your mind and you start to feel out of balance. There has to be a mind-body balance. There needs to be a better balance of mind, heart, and body. So the Tao said, too much thinking, but also wrong-headed thinking. Too much linear thinking, from A to B to C. When you start thinking with too much goal-oriented thinking, how am I going to become more virtuous? How can I build a greater kingdom? Then that necessarily takes you out of seeing the bigger picture. Because seeing the bigger picture takes an intuitive mind, not the linear mind. So the Tao said, too much thinking and wrong-headed thinking. So they advocated two things. Let's remove ourselves from the centers of overly complex civilization and government, move closer to nature. Then let's simplify our lives. And let's clear our minds. And let's feel the rhythm of the earth and of nature. And be more in touch, be more in tune with the inherent beauty and harmony of nature and the universe. And they said, we don't need books to do this. Even a small child has a great intuition for the rhythms of nature and the universe. So this is actually, I think, one of the reasons why the Lao Tzu, which is the first Taoist classic, is the second most widely translated, widely read work of world literature, next to the Bible. 2,500 years after the fact, it still has this appeal because many people in human societies today feel we're too top-heavy and we've lost touch with our innate or intuitive wisdom and awareness of being in balance with nature and with the universe. So I'm just going to read you one story from one of the Taoist classics.
What was the name of that book?
It's called the Lao Tzu, or Tao Te Ching. There's two titles, or the Zhuangzi. And if you just go on my website, if you just Google Mark Unno, my homepage is the first link that comes up. You can see all my courses. If you just click on Chinese religions, there'll be various links to key words and also readings that you can do. Okay. Woodworker Ching carved a piece of wood and made a bell stand, and when it was finished, everyone who saw it marveled, for it seemed to be the work of gods or spirits. But when the Marquis saw it, he said, Woodworker Ching, where did you learn your art of carving a bell stand? And Ching replied, Oh, but Marquis, I'm just a craftsman. How would I have any art? There's one thing I can tell you, though. When I'm going to make a bell stand, I never let it wear out my energy. I always fast in order to still my mind. So here we have mention of a religious practice, going into physical fasting, but the physical fasting is a spiritual and mental purification. When I fasted for 3 days, I no longer have any thought of congratulations or rewards, of titles or stipends. When I fasted for 5 days, I no longer have any thought of praise or blame, of skill or clumsiness. And when I fasted for 7 days, I'm so still that I forget I have 4 limbs, a form, and a body. By that time, the ruler in his court no longer exists for me. I never have any thoughts of the ruler. My skill is concentrated, and all outside distractions fade away. And after that, I go into the mountain forest, and I examine the heavenly nature of the trees. If I find one of superlative form, and I can see a bell stand there, I put my hand to the job of carving. But if I don't see a bell stand seemingly appearing directly out of the trunk of the tree, then I let it go. I don't try to force it. This way, I'm simply matching up heaven with heaven. This way, I'm simply matching up heaven with heaven. And that's probably the reason that people wonder if the results were not made by spirits. Okay. So this episode encapsulates a lot of key features of the Taoist outlook. The emphasis on intuition rather than learning. That if I clear my mind, if I purify my being, my body, spirit, and mind, then it gives me clear awareness of what to do. So I think many of us have had the experience where we get lost in our thoughts, we make a molehill into a mountain, and we get over-worried, but a friend says, hey, let's go take a walk in the woods. And you go for a walk in the woods, and suddenly you have another point of reference. And you realize you made a big deal of something that wasn't such a big deal, and suddenly you feel relieved, and there's even a physical sensation of the mind clearing, and you're having a better sense of your inner compass of where to go. So you could say that that kind of resonates with a kind of a Taoist approach, that you have that wisdom within you, that you have that instinct within you, but that too much learning and too much thinking and too much wrong-headed thinking has made you lost your way. So in contrast to Confucianism, Taoism is very individualistic, not in the Western sense of individual autonomy, but that you can have direct intuition of the truth. And that by simplifying your life, by being more in touch with nature, that you can reconnect with your innate wisdom, your innate intuition, and your inner compass. Question?
So neither of these religions have a god?
You could say that.
Or any specific one thing they worship at all besides nature, like the universe and nature?
Right. And there are mention of spirits, but it's more that nature and the universe are the great umbrella under which spirits and human beings live. And the reason for this is that you can see that in religious studies, we say this is a one-world worldview. There isn't another world outside of it. But in religions that say there is the divine, there is God or some other being that exists in a qualitatively different level from us in this world on earth, that's a two-worlds worldview. And so in that worldview, you can look up to another being or another realm as a source of truth or reality. Whereas if everything's continuous, which it is in both Confucianism and Taoism, there is not another realm to look to.
Well, what do they believe when you die? Like where your soul, or what do they believe? Like there's nothing?
Okay, so that's good. So let's ask Zhuangzi, shall we? There's a passage. Zhuangzi's wife died. When Huizi went to convey his condolences, he found Zhuangzi sitting with his legs sprawled out, pounding on a tub and singing. And Huizi said to Zhuangzi, "You lived with her. She brought up your children and grew old with you. It should be enough simply not to weep at her death, but pounding on a tub and singing, isn't this going too far?" And this is a comment on Confucian practices of mourning. Because the parent-child connection is so important, then funerals and mourning become extremely important in Confucian culture. And so we find in the teachings of Confucius, called the Analects, he says, you should mourn for 3 years. You should wear plain clothes. You should eat plain food so that all your thoughts can be focused on your parents, the deceased. And you should even refrain as much as possible even from working. The Taoists, being the yin to the Confucian yang, said, this is too much. So what does Zhuangzi say? He says, no, you're wrong. When my wife first died, don't you think that I grieved like everyone else? But then I looked back at her beginning and the time before she was born. Not only the time before she was born, but the time before she had a body. Not only the time before she had a body, but the time before she had a spirit. In the midst of the jumble of wonder and mystery, a change took place, and she had a spirit. Another change, and she had a body. Another change, and she was born. Now there's been another change, and she's dead. It's just like the progression of the 4 seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. Now she's going to lie down peacefully in a vast room. If I were to follow her, after her, bawling and sobbing, it would show that I don't understand anything about fate, so I stopped. So there's 2 things that come out of this. One is, yes, they see human existence, including human death and what happens after, as a natural process, just like the progression of the seasons.
Reincarnation?
Not reincarnation, but something akin to that called transformation. So I'm going to get into that, okay, with just a few minutes. So first, natural. It's just like the progression of the 4 seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. But now she's going to lie down peacefully in a vast room. So she is going someplace, like a vast room. And in order to understand that, I'm going to read a passage from Lao Tzu, the Taoist classic. What's that?
I'll list the books on Black.
Yeah. Where he says, the way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. The nameless was the beginning of heaven and earth. The named was the mother of the myriad creatures. Hence, always rid yourself of desires in order to observe its secrets, but always allow yourself to have desires in order to observe its manifestation. The 2 are the same. That is the source of the Tao, or the source of the way, and its manifestation in the world of appearances. The 2 are the same, but diverge in name as they issue forth. Mystery upon mystery, the gatefold of the manifold secrets. So, in a way, this is a creation story, but fundamentally, it's more a story about the source of everything. And for the Taoists, the source of everything is beyond words, is in the Tao, and that Tao is never apart from the present moment. So that if you look deeply enough into each moment, you will find the source, the vast room to which Zhuangzi's wife has gone, or returned, as it were. So it's a kind of, you might say it's a kind of a mystical view, that we all come from that which is a kind of a oneness beyond words, and will always return to that oneness beyond words. But in between, we can experience many different things, many different seasons. We can experience different seasons. We can even experience different forms. So Zhuangzi says, he once dreamt he was a butterfly fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He was so completely the butterfly. He was so completely the butterfly, he didn't know he was Zhuangzi. But then suddenly he awoke, and there he was, solid and unmistakably Zhuangzi. But suddenly, he didn't know if he was Zhuangzi who had just dreamt he was a butterfly, or if he was now a butterfly dreaming, it is now Zhuangzi. Then the thought suddenly occurred to Zhuangzi, Yet, I'm not a butterfly. Between zhuangzi and the butterfly, there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. So for zhuangzi, he says, if we all come from the same source, which is beneath our feet, as it were, in every moment, then ultimately our true nature is that we're one in the Tao. And that's the reason why you can become one with a butterfly, you can become one with your pet dog, you can become one with your lover when you look into her or his eyes, because ultimately you are one another. So I'm just going to conclude. I'm sure you have other questions, but I'm going to conclude for now by saying this is the yin and the yang. Men and women are different. Up and down are not the same. Small and large diverge. But the deeper you look into one opposite, the deeper you look, the more you begin to realize the opposite emerges within that which is, at first, absolutely other. A mountain is very different from a plain, but you look into the workings of the soil in a plain and you realize it was once a mountain. You look at a mountain and it seems to soar up into the sky, but it was the movement of the tectonic plates, and at one time it was flat as a pancake. Men and women may be very, very different, but if they were absolutely different, they could not connect when they looked into each other's eyes. Confucianism, communal, heavily emphasizing learning and close-knit social relations, seems to be the opposite of Daoism, that emphasizes intuition and the individual awareness of the Tao. But for many Chinese, you look deeply into the one and you will find the other. Okay.
See you guys next week. Woo-hoo.